Get your things and leave. This is not your home anymore. The words would replay in Margaret Collins's mind long before that morning was over, but when she first heard them echo in memory, she was still miles away, driving her aging silver sedan down a quiet suburban street lined with maple trees that had just begun to turn a dusty shade of orange. She had left her own small bungalow at exactly 7:15 a.m., as she always did on Thursdays, after pouring herself half a cup of lukewarm coffee she never finished. The radio hummed softly with a weather report predicting a mild 68 degrees by noon, and the sunlight spilled across her dashboard like something hopeful she didn't quite trust. Margaret's hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, fingers slightly stiff from years of arthritis, yet steady enough to guide her toward the house she still believed was partly hers in spirit if not on paper. She had baked a loaf of banana bread the night before, wrapping it carefully in foil the way her own mother had taught her decades ago, pressing the seams down as if sealing kindness into every fold. The neighborhood greeted her with familiar stillness when she finally turned onto Willow Creek Lane, the tires crunching softly over scattered leaves as she slowed to a careful crawl. Children's bicycles lay abandoned near freshly cut lawns, sprinklers ticked rhythmically in the distance, and somewhere a golden retriever barked with the easy confidence of a life without complications. Margaret parked at the curb instead of pulling into the driveway, a small habit she had adopted after Jessica once joked that her old car made the property look dated. She stepped out, smoothing the front of her pale blue cardigan as a gentle breeze brushed against her face, carrying the faint scent of detergent from laundry hanging on a neighbor's line. The house stood exactly as she remembered from the previous week, white shutters framing wide windows, a wreath of artificial eucalyptus hanging slightly crooked on the front door. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to believe that the quiet morning held no shadows, that the tension she had sensed building in recent visits was only a misunderstanding waiting to be dissolved by patience and warm conversation. Her sensible low-heeled shoes tapped lightly against the concrete path as she approached the porch, the banana bread balanced carefully in her arms like an offering she hoped would still matter. She paused before knocking, noticing the reflection of her own cautious smile in the glass panel beside the door, and straightened her posture as if dignity could be worn like a coat against any sudden chill. Somewhere inside, floorboards creaked, followed by the distant clatter of a cupboard shutting too hard, but Margaret drew in a steady breath and lifted her hand anyway, convinced that love, like routine, would guide her safely through whatever waited beyond that threshold. The door opened only halfway, as though the house itself was uncertain about letting Margaret Collins inside, and Jessica Collins stood framed in the narrow space with one hand resting lightly against the polished brass handle, her expression composed but noticeably strained around the edges like a photograph that had been bent too many times. Margaret offered the warmest smile she could gather from a heart that had already begun to flutter with an unnamed unease, lifting the foil-wrapped banana bread slightly, as if it were a peace offering instead of a simple gesture of routine kindness. Jessica's eyes flickered downward toward the bundle and then back to Margaret's face with a polite nod that never quite reached her lips, and she stepped aside just enough to allow entry without fully relinquishing her silent claim over the threshold. Inside, the air carried the faint scent of citrus cleaner mixed with something sharper, perhaps the bitterness of freshly brewed dark roast coffee that had been left to sit too long on a warming plate. Margaret moved carefully across the hardwood floor, conscious of the soft echo of her footsteps, placing her handbag on the small entry table exactly where she had placed it countless times before. Yet today even that familiar motion felt rehearsed rather than natural. Jessica closed the door with a controlled click that seemed louder than necessary and gestured toward the kitchen island where sunlight streamed in through tall windows, illuminating neat rows of decorative canisters arranged with meticulous precision. Margaret set the banana bread down gently, smoothing the foil with nervous fingers while Jessica leaned casually against the marble countertop, arms folded in a posture that suggested both confidence and quiet evaluation. The conversation began with ordinary pleasantries about the weather forecast and the rising cost of groceries, yet beneath each word lingered a subtle tension that Margaret could sense but not fully name, like a faint hum in the walls that no one else appeared to hear. Jessica's remarks soon drifted into observations about space and schedules, about how busy households required careful boundaries, and how modern families thrived best when everyone respected clearly defined roles. Margaret nodded politely, offering soft affirmations while noticing how Jessica's voice grew increasingly measured, each sentence polished to sound reasonable, yet carrying an undertone of something colder. A distant clock ticked steadily above the pantry door, marking seconds that felt heavier than minutes, and Margaret found herself adjusting the sleeve of her cardigan as though shielding her skin from an invisible draft. Through the wide kitchen doorway she glimpsed framed photographs of Daniel smiling at recent company gatherings, his arm around Jessica in images that seemed staged in their perfection, and she wondered fleetingly whether love could become a performance when viewed from the outside. Jessica lifted her coffee mug and took a slow, deliberate sip before setting it down with careful precision, her gaze returning to Margaret with a brightness that bordered on scrutiny, and in that quiet exchange Margaret felt the first undeniable crack forming beneath the surface of what she had always believed was still a place she could safely belong. Jessica's smile remained fixed but thinner now, like a ribbon pulled too tight, as she circled slowly around the kitchen island and began rearranging items that had already been placed with perfect symmetry, the faint scrape of ceramic against marble punctuating a silence that felt increasingly deliberate rather than accidental. Margaret stood near the edge of the counter with her hands lightly clasped in front of her, watching the movement with quiet attentiveness, her eyes drifting from the polished surface to the wide bay window where sunlight spilled across the floor in a golden rectangle that should have felt welcoming but instead seemed to highlight how small she suddenly felt within the carefully curated space. Jessica cleared her throat with a soft, practiced sound that suggested she had rehearsed what she was about to say, and when she finally spoke her tone carried the crisp clarity of someone delivering instructions rather than sharing a conversation. She began mentioning schedules again, referring to the importance of routines in modern households, and the stress that unexpected visits could create, each word wrapped in a polite cadence. That made disagreement seem almost unreasonable. Margaret nodded reflexively, though her chest tightened as she sensed the conversation shifting from subtle hints into unmistakable declarations, the kind that leave no room for misunderstanding. A car door slammed faintly somewhere outside, followed by the distant hum of a passing delivery truck, but inside the kitchen the atmosphere remained suspended in a fragile stillness that pressed gently against Margaret's ribs. Jessica moved closer, resting one manicured hand on the back of a high bar stool, while tilting her head slightly as if assessing whether kindness or firmness would serve her better in the moment. When she finally spoke again, the carefully measured restraint in her voice dissolved into something sharper, and the words fell into the air with startling finality as she stated that Margaret needed to respect the boundaries of the home and consider finding somewhere else to spend her mornings. The statement did not arrive as a shout or an outburst but as a calm verdict delivered with chilling certainty, and that quiet precision made it far more difficult for Margaret to respond without feeling as though she might shatter the fragile dignity she had spent a lifetime protecting. Her fingers instinctively reached for the foil-wrapped loaf on the counter, pressing lightly against the warm surface as if grounding herself in something tangible, while her gaze drifted toward the hallway where framed family portraits seemed suddenly distant and inaccessible. Jessica folded her arms again, her posture conveying both impatience and a strange satisfaction, as though she had been waiting for this confrontation to unfold and now felt relieved to release it into the open. Margaret's lips parted slightly, not to argue but to search for words that might restore the gentle rhythm she had always believed defined family, yet the ticking clock above the pantry door grew louder in her ears, marking the passing seconds with an almost theatrical insistence. Outside, a gust of wind rustled fallen leaves along the driveway, their dry whispering sound drifting faintly through the window screens, and in that quiet moment Margaret understood with a slow sinking clarity that something irreversible had begun to take shape within the walls she had once entered with effortless belonging. Margaret felt the weight of the moment settle over her shoulders like an invisible shawl, as she slowly released her grip on the banana bread and let her hands fall to her sides, her breath measured and quiet as though she feared even the sound of it might disrupt the fragile balance she was still trying to preserve. Jessica remained by the kitchen island with an air of controlled composure, her gaze steady and unyielding, while the soft hum of the refrigerator filled the silence that had suddenly become too thick to ignore. Margaret's eyes drifted toward the hallway again, drawn by a faint movement that barely registered at first, and then she saw him standing there in the half-shadow where the light from the living room met the dimmer glow of the corridor. Daniel Collins leaned against the doorway with one hand resting casually in the pocket of his pressed slacks, his shoulders squared yet strangely still, as if he had been there long enough to witness everything but had chosen not to interrupt. The sight of her son in that quiet, watchful stance sent a small tremor through Margaret's chest, a flicker of hope rising and fading in the same heartbeat, because his expression offered no immediate comfort or condemnation, only a calm neutrality that felt far more unsettling than anger would have been. Jessica noticed him a moment later and straightened almost imperceptibly, smoothing the front of her tailored blouse as though preparing for an audience she believed was already on her side. Margaret forced herself to stand taller, adjusting the strap of her handbag with fingers that had begun to feel cold despite the warm morning sun streaming across the kitchen floor. Daniel's gaze moved slowly from Jessica to Margaret and then back again, his eyes thoughtful and distant, carrying a depth that neither woman could fully read. The ticking clock above the pantry door seemed louder now, each second echoing like a quiet drumbeat against Margaret's ribs, while outside the muffled sound of a lawn mower started somewhere down the block, a reminder that ordinary life continued beyond the invisible boundary of this fragile confrontation. Jessica spoke again with renewed confidence, reiterating her earlier point about boundaries and the importance of maintaining order in a shared household, her voice smooth yet edged with an unmistakable finality that suggested she believed the matter had already been decided. Margaret glanced at Daniel once more, searching his face for the familiar warmth she had known since he was a boy racing through sprinklers on summer afternoons, yet what she found instead was a composed stillness that made her wonder whether love could sometimes disguise itself as distance. Daniel remained silent, his posture relaxed but deliberate, and in that suspended moment Margaret felt the quiet heartbreak of assuming she had already lost something she could never replace, the invisible thread of belonging she had carried into this home now trembling as though it might snap without warning. Margaret lowered her eyes for a brief moment as though gathering fragments of composure scattered across the polished kitchen floor. Then she reached quietly for her handbag on the entry table, lifting it with a careful motion that revealed years of practiced grace even in the face of quiet devastation. The leather strap felt heavier than usual against her shoulder, as if it carried the invisible weight of memories she had once believed were permanent fixtures in this home. Jessica shifted her stance near the island, the faint tap of her manicured nails against the marble surface punctuating the silence with an almost rhythmic impatience, while Daniel remained in the hallway, still as a figure in a painting, his presence both comforting and unbearably distant. Margaret's gaze lingered briefly on the family photographs lining the corridor wall, images frozen in sunlight and laughter, moments captured in glossy frames that now felt like artifacts from another lifetime. She took a slow step toward the door, then another, her low heels making soft measured sounds against the hardwood, as if each footfall marked the closing of a chapter she had not realized was nearing its end. The warm morning light spilling through the windows illuminated tiny dust particles drifting in the air, turning them into golden specks that seemed almost suspended in time, and Margaret wondered whether dignity could be preserved simply by moving forward without protest. Jessica watched with folded arms and a subtle tightening of her jaw, her expression suggesting a mixture of relief and quiet triumph, as though the rearranging of emotional boundaries was as necessary as the spotless order she maintained throughout the house. Margaret paused near the threshold, her hand resting lightly on the cool brass handle, and allowed herself one final glance into the kitchen where the banana bread still sat unopened, its gentle sweetness now an unintended symbol of goodwill that had found no place to land. Outside, the distant hum of suburban life continued with steady indifference, the faint laughter of children echoing from somewhere down the block, the rhythmic swish of tires rolling over pavement, the ordinary sounds forming a soundtrack that contrasted painfully with the silent storm gathering inside her chest. She straightened her cardigan with deliberate care, smoothing invisible creases as if restoring a sense of order within herself before stepping into the crisp air that carried the scent of freshly cut grass and autumn leaves. Behind her, the house remained quiet and immaculate, a picture of stability that concealed the fragile shifting of loyalties unfolding beneath its calm exterior. Margaret drew in a slow breath that tasted faintly of morning sunlight and uncertainty, her posture steady despite the tremor in her heart, and continued toward the driveway with measured determination, unaware that the suspended moment inside those walls was not yet finished shaping the course of her story. Margaret stepped off the porch with quiet restraint, the wooden boards creaking softly behind her as if the house itself were releasing a long-held breath, and she walked toward her parked sedan with the composed rhythm of someone determined not to let the world witness the fracture forming inside her chest. The autumn air felt sharper now, brushing against her cheeks with a coolness that carried the distant scent of fallen leaves and freshly watered lawns, while the sunlight that had seemed so welcoming earlier now appeared almost too bright, exposing every flicker of uncertainty in her expression. She reached the driver's side door and paused, her hand hovering just above the handle as she glanced back toward the house, half expecting the front door to open, half fearing that it might. Inside, Jessica remained near the kitchen island, her posture relaxed but alert, the faint curve of satisfaction at the corner of her lips suggesting she believed the morning had unfolded exactly as she intended. She picked up the untouched banana bread and turned it slowly in her hands, examining the neat foil wrapping with an expression that blended curiosity and quiet dismissal, as though deciding whether it held any remaining value now that its giver had stepped outside. The ticking clock continued its steady count in the background, each second reinforcing the illusion of control that Jessica felt settling comfortably around her shoulders like a tailored jacket. Daniel was still in the hallway, his gaze following Margaret's retreating figure through the narrow pane of glass beside the front door, his face unreadable yet thoughtful in a way that hinted at deeper currents moving beneath the surface. Jessica spoke lightly about reorganizing the guest room and adjusting future plans, her voice carrying an almost buoyant tone that contrasted sharply with the subdued atmosphere lingering in the corners of the house. Outside, Margaret finally opened the car door and slid into the familiar seat, the faint scent of lavender from an old air freshener greeting her like a small reminder that some spaces remained entirely her own. She rested her hands on the steering wheel without starting the engine, watching the reflection of the white-shuttered windows in the rearview mirror as if trying to memorize the precise angle at which everything had changed. A gentle breeze rustled through the branches above, scattering a few crisp leaves across the driveway in quiet spirals, and she closed her eyes for a brief moment, steadying her breath while the distant sound of a passing school bus drifted down the street. Back inside, Jessica set the banana bread down with a soft, decisive motion and reached for her coffee mug, lifting it in a silent gesture of private victory, convinced that the fragile balance of power within the household had shifted permanently in her favor. Daniel remained motionless in the hallway, the faint shadow of a decision forming behind his calm expression, and in that suspended stillness the morning lingered on the edge of a turning point neither woman could yet fully see. Margaret kept her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel as though the familiar texture of worn leather could steady the quiet tremor that had begun to move through her fingers, her eyes fixed on the reflection of the house framed in the rearview mirror where white shutters and tidy hedges seemed to promise a stability that no longer felt certain. A cloud drifted slowly across the sun, softening the brightness that had filled the driveway moments earlier, and the shifting light created a brief illusion that time itself had paused, waiting for someone to make the next move. Inside the kitchen, Jessica set her coffee mug down with a controlled motion and glanced toward the hallway, expecting Daniel to step forward with a reassuring nod or a casual remark that would confirm the new order she believed had already been established. Instead, he remained silent for another heartbeat, then another, the stillness around him growing almost theatrical in its intensity. Margaret reached into her handbag and pulled out a folded tissue, pressing it gently against the corner of her eye even though no tears had yet fallen, as if acknowledging an emotion she was determined not to let fully surface. The distant sound of wind chimes from a neighboring porch drifted faintly through her open car window, their delicate notes rising and fading like unanswered questions. Back inside, Daniel finally moved, his footsteps measured and deliberate as he crossed the polished floor toward the kitchen island, his expression calm yet carrying a gravity that made Jessica straighten instinctively, the faint confidence in her posture beginning to waver beneath an unfamiliar uncertainty. He paused beside the counter, reaching into the inside pocket of his navy blazer with a quiet precision that suggested careful preparation rather than impulsive reaction, and withdrew a thick ivory envelope sealed with a narrow strip of gold adhesive. Jessica's gaze sharpened with curiosity, then flickered with something closer to apprehension as she watched him place the envelope gently on the marble surface between them, its presence small yet commanding in the bright rectangle of morning light. Outside, Margaret noticed the front door opening in her mirror and felt her pulse quicken as Daniel stepped onto the porch for a moment, his silhouette framed against the pale sky before he turned back inside without looking toward the driveway. She drew in a steady breath, unsure whether the movement signaled farewell or something else entirely, while fallen leaves skittered across the asphalt in restless patterns. Inside, Jessica picked up the envelope with careful fingers, her earlier composure dissolving into a tight, controlled smile as she slid a nail beneath the seal and unfolded the crisp pages within, her eyes scanning lines of formal language that carried the unmistakable weight of final decisions. The ticking clock continued its relentless rhythm above the pantry door, marking the instant when certainty began to fracture, and Daniel stood quietly beside the island, his gaze steady and unflinching as the fragile illusion of victory slipped silently from Jessica's grasp like sunlight retreating behind gathering clouds. Jessica's eyes moved rapidly across the printed lines as though searching for a hidden explanation that would soften the meaning taking shape before her. Yet the formal structure of the document allowed no such comfort, its carefully worded sentences carrying the unmistakable tone of finality that filled the bright kitchen with a quiet, disorienting chill. The morning light still streamed through the tall windows, illuminating the smooth marble surface and the untouched loaf of banana bread beside her hand. But now that warm glow seemed almost indifferent to the emotional shift unfolding within the room. Daniel remained standing at a measured distance, his shoulders squared and his expression steady, the calmness in his posture suggesting that the decision reflected on those pages had been formed long before this moment. Jessica lowered the paper slightly, her breath catching in a subtle uneven rhythm that contrasted with the composed confidence she had displayed only minutes earlier, and she looked up at him with a mixture of disbelief and dawning realization. Outside in the driveway, Margaret noticed the faint movement of curtains in the front window and leaned forward slightly in her seat, her fingers tightening around the steering wheel as a quiet instinct urged her to stay rather than drive away. The distant laughter of children returning from a morning walk drifted faintly through the open car window, their carefree voices creating a strange counterpoint to the tension she could sense even from afar. Inside the kitchen, Jessica placed the envelope back on the counter with careful precision, as though sudden movements might shatter the fragile illusion that this was merely a misunderstanding waiting to be resolved. Her gaze shifted briefly toward the hallway, then returned to Daniel, searching his face for hesitation or regret. Yet what she found instead was a quiet clarity that felt more decisive than anger could ever be. The ticking clock above the pantry door continued its steady cadence, each passing second reinforcing the irreversible nature of the choice laid out before her, while the faint hum of the refrigerator seemed louder than before, filling the silence left by words neither of them immediately spoke. Margaret watched the house in stillness, her heart beating with a cautious mixture of sorrow and something she could not yet name, as the sunlight began to soften again under the slow drift of passing clouds. Jessica finally exhaled, the controlled strength in her posture giving way to a subtle tremor of uncertainty, and in that suspended moment the balance of power that had seemed so firmly in her grasp dissolved like morning mist under the quiet weight of truth. Daniel's voice when he spoke carried no harshness, only a calm resolve shaped by weeks of silent observation, and the sound of it moved through the kitchen with a finality that signaled not a sudden impulse but the inevitable arrival of emotional justice unfolding exactly where it had once been denied. Margaret remained seated in her car as the quiet morning stretched forward with a strange gentleness she had not expected, the soft hum of the engine still absent beneath her hands as though the moment itself had chosen to hold her there just a little longer. A single leaf drifted down onto the windshield and rested near the wiper blade, its fragile veins glowing amber in the filtered sunlight, and she watched it with distant focus while her thoughts slowly settled into a calmer rhythm. Inside the house, the tension that had once felt sharp and brittle now seemed to dissolve into a subdued stillness, the kind that follows when truths long ignored finally find their voice. Daniel stood near the kitchen island with the same composed posture he had carried all morning, yet there was a quiet release in his shoulders, a subtle easing that suggested the weight of unspoken conflict had begun to lift. Jessica remained motionless for a moment, her gaze lowered toward the formal pages still resting against the marble surface, her earlier certainty replaced by a fragile awareness of how easily control can slip away when built upon assumptions rather than understanding. The ticking clock above the pantry door continued its steady cadence, but now the sound blended into the background like the ordinary rhythm of life returning after a passing storm. Outside, Margaret finally exhaled fully and reached for the ignition key, turning it with deliberate care as the familiar vibration of the engine brought a quiet reassurance that forward motion was once again possible. She adjusted the rearview mirror and caught a final glimpse of the white-shuttered house, its neat symmetry unchanged yet no longer carrying the same emotional gravity it had held only minutes before. A gentle warmth spread across her chest. Not the sharp triumph of vindication but the steadier comfort of knowing her worth had not vanished simply because someone else had failed to see it. She guided the car slowly down the driveway, the tires rolling over, scattered leaves that crunched softly beneath them, and merged onto the quiet street where rows of maple trees swayed in the light breeze like silent witnesses to her departure. Inside the kitchen, Daniel gathered the envelope and placed it neatly beside the untouched banana bread. His expression thoughtful as he turned toward the hallway where framed photographs still reflected moments of laughter that now seemed both distant and instructive. Jessica remained by the counter, her posture subdued, her gaze lingering on the sunlight pooling across the floor as though recognizing that the clarity it offered could not be avoided or rewritten. Margaret continued driving toward the familiar curve of her neighborhood, the late morning sky stretching wide and pale blue above her, and as she passed a small park where children chased each other across the grass, she allowed herself the faintest smile, a quiet acknowledgement that endings can sometimes open doors to beginnings shaped not by loss but by the rediscovery of dignity and peace.